imagine you apply for a benefit that you're entitled to. This could be housing, welfare, unemployment, or even a visa, and you're being refused. And you ask why, and you're being told, well, the system made a decision. You ask if you can understand how the decision was made, but you're being told, no, that's proprietary. You ask how you can appeal, and you're being told to fill in a form, and that form goes back to the same system. And unfortunately, this is not hypothetical. This has actually happened in the Netherlands with child benefit fraud, where thousands of families were wrongfully accused of committing child benefit fraud by an algorithm that determined that. And those families were mostly from minority backgrounds in the Netherlands and held dual citizenship. And that not only meant for them that they had to pay back thousands of euros to the government, they also lost homes because of these financial burdens, and families were taken into care, and essentially that also brought down the government in the Netherlands. And the system, or this algorithm that was used, was not only biased, it was opaque, and it was also unaccountable. And that did not only cause harms to the many families that it destroyed, it also caused harm to our democracies by breaking the trust in the institutions that are meant to serve us. And this is what I want to talk to you about today, not whether AI is good or bad for a democracy, but what democracy needs from AI and how we can rebuild that trust. Because democracy runs on trust, and AI now sits at points where citizens meet the state, which means it sits at points where trust is either built or lost. So I'm a professional from the democracy field. I'm not a technical expert. I work at International IDEA, as Michael already mentioned, which is an intergovernmental organization with a mandate to strengthen and promote democracies all around the world. And we work with governments, electoral bodies, and civil societies on how technologies impact our democracies. So again, I'm not a technical expert, but I'm here to tell you now what I think democracy needs from AI. So let me start by outlining a few areas on how AI already shapes democracies today. There are plenty of areas, but because I also want to spend more time on how we can solve these tensions between AI and democracy, let me only mention 3 big ones that I think are really important. And the first one is our information environment. Because AI puts our information environment and also our integrity under significant pressure. And this is not what many may think, because AI persuades voters or makes people believe into something else they have not believed before. But we at IDEA think that the problem is more polarization, public polarization, and voter confusion. And here, for example, we can also look at Hungary's recent election, where the political campaigns online have been full of AI-generated and manipulated content, but first analysts question whether that actually changed or whether that actually had an influence on people believing in something that they have not believed before, and whether instead it perhaps did more reinforce existing fears and harden political camps. And this is not to dismiss the effect of disinformation, but it just means that methodologically we perhaps cannot measure the impact of disinformation campaigns through AI-generated content on the outcomes of an election, and we have to look at other things. But certainly we can see that AI is widening the overtone window of what is admissible, and also that one narrative can appear at different forms at once. It can be an audio message, what we see a lot on social media, or a video clip, or also an answer of a chatbot. And so with AI, it's not only changing the speed and scale in which content is produced, including disinformation, but it's also flipping the economics of our information environment, because attackers have to spend now less time producing content that they can also use for example, disinformation campaigns, while on the response side, institutions, the media, civil society organizations have to spend much more of their time on verifying or tracing in the first place, and then verifying information. And it makes it much harder for them to respond before public trust is damaged. And on top of that, the problem is not only for democracies that there is now false information, but also that genuine and authentic information becomes easier to deny and is being doubted by the public. But we should also look beyond the creational side of AI, because generative AI only produces or touches upon the content side. Yeah, now we're in the right slide. But platform design and algorithms that tend to favor engagement over democratic health determine whether a piece of content stays marginal or it reaches millions. And then there are many actors who exploit AI to attack the vulnerabilities in our democracies and who want to pollute the information environment. But there's also many actors that just do it for the money, because attention pays, clicks pay. And while the motives may be commercial, the damage is still democratic. And yeah, all three layers are also largely opaque to the public. And the public has very little ability to scrutinize these systems. And then I want to speak about the use of AI in public administration. We also have written extensively about this in a report that you can find on our website, which is called Rights in the Digital Age, but I've also linked this later in the slides. But I want to mention only a few of them today. So one is facial recognition technology. Unfortunately, we still see that these technologies tend to be very prone to error and bias. For example, they work quite well with subjects of lighter skin, but with subjects of darker skin, there's much more, or the error rate is much higher, and they also work better on male subjects than on female subjects. And this is very problematic when it has impact on our rights and our life, because in the US, for example, 3 black men were wrongfully accused and arrested because of an error in the facial recognition system. And that's why when, for example, AI is also being used for migration and asylum decisions, that's also a very high-risk area, because again, these are decisions about our human life and about our fundamental human rights. And then I also want to speak about the COMPASS system, which is a system used in the US for predictive sentencing. It's a system, an algorithm that, based on different facts, determines whether a defender is likely, or the likelihood to re-offend. And based on that score, the courts, the judges, then determine the length of a prison sentence. And this is also something that was challenged by a defendant in the US, but he was told that he cannot, or this defendant wanted to understand how the algorithm works, and he was told that this is proprietary and not even the courts are allowed to see the methodology behind the system, which again is, I think, very difficult from a democratic point of view, that there's so much priority given over trade secrets when there's like fundamental rights at stake. And here I also want to mention the importance, or, well, no, sorry, I jumped. But in the Netherlands, for example, they solved this by, or they tried to solve this after the scandal by implementing algorithm transparency registers, which also become now, I mean, they were first in a piloting phase, but this will now also become mandatory for high-risk systems in line with the EU AI Act. And while this is a good ambition, it's questionable how much this actually helps, because these registers only tell you that a public administration has used an algorithm to make a decision, and at most it explains in very broad terms how the system works, but it does not really give any insights on the code that, how the code is written, doesn't give insights on the training data and how the internal logic works to truly make the system auditable. So this transparency register would have probably also not really helped in the defendant in the Compass case. And yeah, I want to mention here the importance of transparency, not only for the code, but also for the training data, because yeah, a code can be written flawlessly, but errors can still occur in the training data. And here we can distinguish between sort of two types of transparency. One is vendor transparency, meaning that the public body that uses the tool has enough information on the design, development, and performance of the system in order to adequately oversee and procure it. And then we also need public transparency to a degree, and I will talk more about this also later, where there's enough information that's also being communicated to the public to hold their governments accountable and to adequately scrutinize the processes and decisions. And then thirdly, I want to talk about political participation and exclusion, because AI does not affect all political actors equally. And here I think the numbers are really shocking, because 96% of all deepfakes online depict women in non-consensual sexual imagery. And this is also something that we at IDEA have looked at in the Brazil's 2024 municipality election, where we saw that this was a very common tactic to drive female political candidates out of public spaces. And this does not, or this already starts at a very young age, unfortunately. A global study of 14,000 girls, underage girls, across 22 countries found that half of them have been harassed for posting online, and that severely discouraged 20% of them to ever post publicly or post their political opinions online. So this is very problematic from a democratic point of view, because if 20 or if 50%, half of the population doesn't feel comfortable participating in online spaces, which are now a huge democratic platform, that's very worrisome. But I've talked now a lot about the challenges of AI to democracy, but I also don't think or want to give the impression that technology is all doom and gloom, because technology has also always been part of how democracies can improve themselves. And we do see a lot of benefits in technology for democracy. To mention only a few of them, for example, we have benefits in political finance. The UK is currently exploring to have AI tools help them with the administrative processes of auditing campaign finance. And then we also have benefits when it comes to more meaningful public participation in policy making. For example, Taiwan has used an AI tool to help them cluster and summarize citizen input. And then we also have benefit in electoral administration, which can be very burdensome processes. And here AI tools have been used to clean up voter lists where sometimes there have been duplicate entries or there have been eligible voters but have not been registered yet. So I'm really all for AI in democratic life, but I think we need to have the necessary safeguards and principles that make those gains that I mentioned here and those benefits possible. Because it's just like with a seatbelt, like the car was never the problem, but the problem was using a very powerful technology without enough protection. And the seatbelt also did not slow down a car, it only made driving safer. And I think AI is exactly also at this moment right now. So what does a democracy need from AI? And here I want to mention 8 principles for a democratic AI, which are explainability, human oversight, making sure that always there's a human staying in the loop, data protection and privacy, contestability, and accountability. And I want to spend a little bit more time talking about transparency, auditability, and interoperability. Transparency is a really important principle that's also mentioned in a lot of international human rights frameworks and also embraced by international bodies, such as, for example, the UNESCO recommendations of the ethics of AI, or the Council of Europe Framework Convention of AI, or also the Open Government Partnership. And I already said a bit before about transparency, but let me add 2 more thoughts here. Because I think there's also a fairness issue here. In some instances and with some public bodies that we've worked with, vendors train their system on public data, but then they make it proprietary and sell the insights back to the state. That's why we say procurement rules need to, from the start, already protect public rights over trade secrets and find solutions that reflect that. And then I understand that in some instances, it's important also to protect intellectual property, or also, for example, in contexts where the data is very sensitive, when it's about personal data, then of course full transparency is difficult. But the answer is not full secrecy, but instead we should look at qualified transparency, which means still documenting everything clearly. And another solution could, for example, be to give independent auditors access under confidentiality. Because if we think of auditability, this is something that we have in so many other areas that affect human life and our rights at scale, for example, in pharmaceuticals or also in food safety. So why don't we do this also for AI? And then last, interoperability. This may be less known as a democratic principle, but if democratic institutions depend on systems that cannot work together, also with already pre-existing systems that they have in place, or lock them into one vendor, then they lose control. And you cannot really have real oversight of a system if you can only audit a system with the vendor's own tools. So interoperability is very important here because it helps institutions stay independent. It lets them switch, it fixes problems, And that ability to also always correct course is a core part of our democracy. So I want to end with two messages, and I hope you can take them away for your work. First is on time, because democratic institutions operate on timescales of decades and centuries. Constitutions outlast their governments, rights outlast products, and the institutions that sustain democratic life are also built slow. Sometimes I agree, maybe too slow, but also speed without deliberation is not really the same as democracy. Meanwhile, AI, by contrast, is deployed on timescales of quarters, of product cycles, of funding rounds, and this is a mismatch that is a real structural problem, in my opinion, of our current times. But I think here the open source, open technology community is much better equipped to solve this tension, because you care about long-term maintenance, you care about sustainability, and about projects that outlast their founders. And because whatever the model, democratic institutions depend on something that is built in democratic time and not on product time, because the technical decisions that we're making today can shape how citizens are governed for decades now. And then lastly, digital public infrastructure and sovereignty. Many of the benefits that I mentioned depend on the digital infrastructure that now most of public life runs on. This can be identity systems, payment schemes, data centers, civic platforms, so these are the rails. And next to that sits digital sovereignty, meaning the ability to govern one's own stack and not be captured by a single vendor. So the key question here is also not necessarily who owns this. There's many different models, public, private, or a mix of both of them. But the key question is whether it is built about democratic principles and whether we can still govern it tomorrow. And here we say that needs four things: rights, rule of law, representation, and participation.
I think this is a global we. I think we see what kind of impact AI systems can have. And we sometimes make joke that the most successful products EU is producing are regulations. If you look at this and how much impact AI systems can have on daily lives of every person, I think looking into regulations is a good thing. We do not want that a few people, few organizations have that power to do this. So we all are responsible to have this kind of democratic control. And I think the 8 principles Juliane presented are very well resonating with the understanding, the self-understanding of the open source community. So I do not see so much differences here, and I think it was great having you on stage talking to us about this one, but at the end I think we hopefully all agree that this is valuable good things we should do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.